The sound of a gun being cocked was not unfamiliar to Bumpy Johnson. It was a sound that had followed him through decades of violence, betrayal, and survival. He had heard it enough times to recognize it instantly, not just with his ears, but with his body. Muscle memory took over before thought. When he stepped into his Harlem apartment late that February night, exhausted and heavy with smoke and whiskey, the metallic click froze him in place. His hand moved automatically toward his waistband, toward the weight that had saved his life more than once. Then he saw who held the gun. The danger did not stand in the shadows or hide behind a rival's grin. It stood barefoot in the middle of his living room, shaking. His wife, her rehearsal dress still clung to her body. Tears streaked her face, and her hands trembled so badly the barrel wavered in uneven circles. This was not an ambush. This was fear, and fear coming from the woman he loved was more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. Bumpy stopped moving. He did not draw. He did not reach. He understood instantly that this moment required something different than violence. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands to show her he meant no harm. The city's noise drifted through the window, distant and uncaring. Inside that room, time tightened. When he spoke her name, it was soft, careful, not afraid. He had faced death before without flinching. But this was different. This was the one shot he couldn't dodge. Her voice barely carried when she finally spoke. It was cracked, exhausted, worn thin by weeks of terror she had carried alone. She did not accuse him. She did not threaten him. She asked a question so small it almost disappeared into the air. "Could you protect me?" 4 words that crushed his chest harder than any bullet ever had. In those words lived the phone calls, the footsteps behind her, the knife pinned to their door. She was not questioning his power. She was questioning her survival. Bumpy knew most men would lie, promise safety, promise guards, distance, solutions that sounded strong. He had built his reputation on strength, but he would not build his marriage on a lie. He looked at her, really looked, and saw that what she needed was not comfort but truth. When he answered no, it was not weakness, it was honesty. The word landed between them like glass shattering. Her grip tightened, her heart broke out loud. She asked what she was doing there then, what life she was living if death followed her everywhere. Bumpy took a slow step forward, measuring each inch, choosing every word like it could decide whether either of them lived. He told her the truth no one else would have dared say, that leaving would not save her, that hiding would not erase her importance, that the only way forward was not protection but transformation. That night did not end a marriage, it forged something stronger. Bumpy did not offer her escape, he offered her power. He told her she would become someone too dangerous to touch, not because of him, but because of herself. In that moment, fear began to change shape. It was no longer just something done to her, it became something she could return. To understand why that moment mattered, you had to understand the woman holding the gun. Before Harlem, before fame, before danger, she had already survived hate in its rawest form. She had watched men in white hoods burn homes for pleasure. She had learned early that safety was temporary, and silence was never protection. Survival was already written into her bones. She just hadn't known it yet. Their story did not begin in that apartment. It began months earlier, on a night soaked in blood and jazz. Harlem was tense then, fractured by old rivalries that refused to die. Power was shifting, and men were falling. Bumpy walked into a jazz club that night carrying the weight of a war he had just ignited. He smelled like violence. He looked like consequence. And instead of running, she sang. Her voice cut through the room and through him. It carried pain, history, and truth without apology. For the first time in years, Bumpy felt something other than anger. He listened, forgotten by the world he ruled for 3 minutes at a time. When their eyes met later, neither pretended. She saw the blood, he saw the strength, and neither of them lied. She told him she had seen worse than blood. She told him she knew who he was, and still she stayed. Not because she was reckless, but because she recognized honesty when she saw it. Their bond was not built on illusion, it was built on truth spoken early and often, even when it hurt. As the city learned she mattered to him, danger followed her footsteps. Threats escalated. Watching turned into hunting, and when fear finally cornered her in that apartment, she did not beg. She asked the only question that mattered. Could you protect me? The answer reshaped everything. Because instead of promising safety, Bumpy promised something harder: survival through strength, through awareness, through refusing to be helpless. And when she lowered the gun, she was no longer asking to be saved. She was choosing to become dangerous. That choice would ripple through Harlem for decades. They began quietly. No dramatic speeches, no declarations of war. Survival training rarely looks heroic in the moment. It looks like repetition, bruised hands, and learning to breathe through fear. Bumpy took her into basements and empty rooms where nobody asked questions. He taught her how to stand, how to hold a weapon without letting it control her, how to notice what most people missed. She learned how danger moved, how it announced itself before it arrived, how silence could be louder than threats. Each lesson stripped away another layer of fear and replaced it with awareness. At first, her hands shook every time she fired, not because she lacked courage, but because courage is not the absence of fear, it is control over it. Bumpy never mocked her hesitation. He understood it. He had lived it. He reminded her that fear was information, not weakness. You listen to it, then you decide. Slowly, shots began to land where she aimed. Bottles shattered. Confidence followed. What began as survival became instinct. While she trained, Bumpy worked the streets. Threats rarely come from nowhere. They come from pride wounded and power challenged. He traced the danger back to unfinished business, to a man who believed revenge could restore dignity. Michael Malone did not care about Harlem. He cared about his brother's broken body and his own injured pride. In his mind, hurting Bumpy's wife was balance. Bumpy understood that logic well enough to know it would not stop on its own. When Bumpy responded, he did not start with blood. He started with fire and message. Empty buildings burned. Businesses collapsed overnight. Nothing random, nothing sloppy. Each move was calculated to speak directly to the man responsible. This was not retaliation for emotion. It was strategy. The message was simple: you will lose more than you gain. The meeting that followed was tense and brief. No raised voices, no threats shouted across tables, just truth laid bare. Michael believed fear could still win. Bumpy knew better. He had already crossed that bridge years ago. When the conversation ended, only one of them understood what was coming. The other mistook restraint for mercy. Even after Michael fled, the shadows did not fully retreat. Fear does not vanish just because one name is removed. Someone still wanted to prove something. That is when the message on the door appeared. A personal violation designed to remind her she was still vulnerable. It was meant to break her resolve. Instead, it tested it. That night she did not run. She did not hide. She waited. Gun in hand, eyes fixed on the door, she confronted the truth Bumpy had given her. Protection was not guaranteed. Choice was. When he walked in and saw her, he understood immediately. This was the moment where words would either mean something or mean nothing. She asked again. He answered again. No, not safety, not guarantees, only honesty and partnership. He told her the danger would never fully leave. What could change was how she met it. When she set the gun down, it was not surrender, it was commitment. From that point forward, Harlem watched differently. Some expected her to disappear, others expected weakness. Instead, they saw consistency. She moved with purpose. She noticed tails before they closed distance. She trusted instincts sharpened by truth. Danger tested her, and for the first time it found resistance. The day it came openly, in the middle of the street, there was no hesitation. Two men thought daylight meant immunity. They thought witnesses meant safety. They misunderstood Harlem. They misunderstood her. When the moment came, she did exactly what she had been taught. She did not threaten. She acted. One shot changed everything. Not because a man fell, but because a myth did. The myth that she was just a weakness. The myth that she was protected only by proximity to power. In that instant, she became power. Harlem saw it. The underworld heard about it before nightfall. By the time the sirens arrived, the story was already set. Nobody described her, nobody spoke, silence protected its own. That silence was louder than any statement. It said, "This line is closed, do not cross it again." When retaliation was planned, it never reached her. It was intercepted, dismantled, and returned broken. Bumpy made sure the lesson was not fatal but unforgettable. Fear travels faster when it has survivors to spread it. Those men carried the message out of Harlem on shaking legs. From then on, things shifted. Respect replaced curiosity. Distance replaced pursuit. She was no longer discussed as leverage. She was discussed as risk. And in Harlem, risk is weighed carefully. The woman who once asked if she could be protected no longer needed the answer. She had become someone others needed protection from. And Bumpy, watching from the edge, knew the truth. Teaching her to survive had not just saved her life, it had changed the balance of power in Harlem forever. Power does not announce itself loudly when it settles in. It becomes visible through absence, fewer threats, fewer shadows following at night, fewer careless comments spoken too close. After that afternoon on Lenox Avenue, the city recalculated. Men who once believed proximity to Bumpy Johnson made her vulnerable now understood the opposite. She was no longer bait, she was a boundary. Harlem adjusted around that truth quietly, the way it always did when something fundamental changed. Bumpy watched this shift with mixed emotion. Pride came easily. Fear did not leave as quickly. Teaching someone to survive means accepting that one day they will face danger alone. He had prepared her for that, but preparation never erases concern. What it does erase is helplessness. He saw it in how she walked now, how her eyes scanned rooms without panic, how she noticed what others ignored. She was not hardened, she was sharpened. When retaliation plans surfaced, they were dealt with before they could breathe. Information flowed through Harlem faster than threats could move. Men talked, phones rang, warnings traveled. By the time decisions were made elsewhere, outcomes were already decided here. That efficiency did not come from fear alone. It came from respect. Harlem respected strength that defended, not exploited. The message sent to those who tried again was precise. They were not killed. They were corrected. Pain teaches faster when it leaves memory intact. When those men were released miles away, broken but alive, they carried Harlem's warning with them. They spoke it carefully. They spoke it honestly. Do not touch her. Do not touch him. Do not test this. That message reached ears it needed to reach. Sit-downs replaced schemes. Agreements replaced aggression. Not because Bumpy demanded dominance, but because conflict no longer promised profit. Stability returned, fragile but real. Harlem's underground understood the rules again, and rules, even brutal ones, are better than chaos. Then came the arrest. Federal charges do not announce themselves politely. One day power walks freely, the next it is numbered and locked away. When Bumpy was taken, many assumed the balance would collapse. They had seen this story before. Remove the figurehead and watch the structure fall. They underestimated the woman who had learned not just survival, but leadership. She did not panic. She did not flee. She stepped forward. Harlem watched carefully, waiting to see who she would become without him beside her. She answered without speeches. Operations continued. Disputes were settled. Money flowed where it was supposed to. The streets stayed quiet. Quiet became confirmation. Challenges came quickly. Rivals always test transitions. They assumed patience meant weakness. They assumed mercy meant hesitation. They learned otherwise. When warnings were ignored, consequences followed swiftly. Not loud, not dramatic, just effective. Fires burned empty buildings. Operations vanished overnight. No bodies, no noise, just absence again. People began speaking her name with the same caution they once reserved for his, not because she mimicked him, but because she had become something different. She listened longer. She calculated deeper. She punished less often but more precisely. Harlem did not just survive under her, it stabilized. While Bumpy sat behind concrete and steel, she carried both of their legacies. She visited him when allowed, speaking in code, sharing victories without bragging, concerns without fear. He saw it in her eyes. She was no longer waiting for him to return to fix things. She was running them. That realization did something rare. It brought him peace. Knowing the world he built would not crumble in his absence freed something inside him. He worried less. He slept more. Pride replaced guilt. He had not condemned her to danger. He had equipped her for reality. Years passed like that. Quiet years, productive years. Harlem changed, but it did not fracture. When Bumpy finally returned, he did not find disorder. He found structure stronger than before. When he asked if things had held together, her answer was simple. They had grown. They walked Harlem side by side again, not as protector and protected, but as equals. The city noticed. Respect deepened, stories adjusted. The question that once defined them no longer needed repeating. Protection had transformed into partnership. The night he collapsed years later, she was there. No panic, no denial, just presence. He had promised honesty, and he had kept it until the end. When Harlem buried him, they did not just mourn a man. They acknowledged a chapter closing. What remained was her, still standing, still respect. Ed, still dangerous in the quietest way. She did not seek monuments. She did not rewrite history. She lived it. And in doing so, she proved the truth of that night long ago. The most powerful thing Bumpy Johnson ever did was admit his limits and teach someone else to rise beyond them. After his death, Harlem did not collapse into chaos the way outsiders expected. Power vacuums only exist when nothing solid has been built underneath, and what Bumpy left behind was not just an empire, but a system. At the center of it stood a woman who had already proven she could carry weight without flinching. She did not step into the spotlight, she simply continued. Harlem noticed the absence of fear more than the absence of a man. People came to her not out of obligation but trust. Shop owners, musicians, families who needed help when rent was due or trouble was circling. She listened before she spoke. She measured before she acted. When she intervened, problems stopped following people home. That was the difference. Protection was not about dominance, it was about containment. Harlem felt safer not because violence increased, but because it became unnecessary. Those who underestimated her did so quietly now, usually once. They assumed time softened resolve. They assumed loss weakened judgment. They learned instead that grief can sharpen focus. She had lived with danger long enough to understand its patterns. She knew when to respond and when silence carried more power. Harlem's underworld. RLD adjusted accordingly, respecting boundaries they had once ignored. She never remarried. Love, for her, had not been something replaceable. It had been a partnership forged in truth, fear, and mutual resolve. She carried Bumpy's memory without romanticizing it. She remembered the honesty more than the legend. The moment that defined everything had not involved power or violence, but truth spoken when lying would have been easier. As decades passed, her name became something separate from his. Younger generations knew her not as someone's wife, but as a figure who had held Harlem steady during its most vulnerable years. They heard stories of a woman who walked without bodyguards, who settled disputes with words when possible, and with consequences when necessary. Respect followed her naturally. When journalists asked her later what it had been like, she never spoke about fear first. She spoke about honesty, about how the most dangerous thing Bumpy ever gave her was not a gun, but the truth. He had trusted her enough not to pretend. That trust had changed the course of her life. It had turned vulnerability into strength. She lived a long life, long enough to see Harlem change faces, names, and rhythms. Buildings rose and fell, politics shifted, but certain rules remained untouched. You do not threaten what Harlem protects. You do not mistake quiet for weakness. Those rules were not written anywhere. They were learned. When she finally passed, the gathering was smaller, his, but heavier in meaning. People came because they wanted to, not because history demanded it. They came because she had been present in their lives when it mattered. That kind of legacy cannot be staged. In the end, her story was never about standing behind a powerful man. It was about standing beside one, then standing alone when required. It was about learning that protection is temporary, but self-possession endures. And it all began with a question asked through tears and fear. Can you protect me? No, but I can teach you how to protect yourself. That answer did not just save her life. It reshaped Harlem's understanding of power. It proved that honesty, when paired with resolve, can be more dangerous than any weapon. And that is why her story survives. Not as myth. As instruction, time has a way of softening edges but sharpening meaning. Long after the names faded from headlines and the streets changed their faces, the lesson remained intact. Harlem remembered not just what happened, but why it mattered. It remembered that survival is not luck, and power is not noise. Power is preparation. Power is honesty. Power is refusing to pretend danger does not exist. People still told the story quietly, never exaggerated, never rushed. Not because it needed mystery, but because it deserved respect. They spoke of a woman who was never meant to rule, yet ruled anyway. Not through fear alone, but through consistency, through fairness, through consequences that made sense. Harlem does not follow chaos for long. It follows those who understand balance. What made her different was not the gun she carried, but the discipline she learned. She did not chase enemies. She did not provoke challenges. She waited. And when action was necessary, it was final enough to end discussion. That kind of restraint builds something stronger than fear. It builds certainty. Certainty keeps streets quiet. Young women in Harlem grew up hearing her name and understanding what it represented. Not violence, but agency. The idea that protection does not always come from being hidden behind someone stronger. Sometimes it comes from becoming strong enough that hiding is no longer required. That lesson traveled further than any bullet ever could. She never claimed credit for holding Harlem together. She never corrected stories that shrank or expanded her role. She understood that real influence does not need constant defense. It lives in outcomes, in what does not happen, in the threats that stop forming before they are spoken. When asked late in life if she had ever been afraid, she answered honestly, of course she had. Fear never disappeared, but fear stopped being the decision-maker. That distinction mattered. Fear can warn you. It should never own you. She learned that the night she lowered the gun and chose truth over comfort. In the end, her life became proof of something simple and unsettling, that honesty can be more dangerous than deception, that admitting limits can create strength. That love built on truth lasts longer than love built on promises that cannot be kept. Harlem did not remember her because she belonged to a legend. Harlem remembered her because she became one, not by chasing power, but by accepting responsibility when it arrived. And that responsibility reshaped a community. The story does not end with death. It never does. It ends every time someone hears it and understands the lesson. Protection is temporary. Awareness is permanent, and the most powerful thing you can give someone you love is not safety, but the ability to survive without you. That is the story history rarely tells, and the one Harlem never forgot.